Well, welcome, Jess Dorr. We are talking about all things threads today. For those of you who haven't met Jess, Jess is the head of our client services division here at Social Assurance, and I'm excited to talk to you about threads.
It's great to be here. It's not every day that a social media platform bursts onto the scenes immediately after a holiday weekend, right?
Sure. Why not? I mean,
why not?
Yeah. So we've got a lot to talk about.
Yes.
There's a ton of stats about threads already, but I think the one that stands out now that we're 5 days in, we have 100 million users now on threads.
Yeah, I think that is kind of important context, Ben. Can you kind of take us through how the user count has grown over even the past days and what that looks like? And
yeah, I think there's volumes already written. I don't know if they're posted, threaded, tweeted, whatever you want to say, however they got out there. There's volumes already been written, but the main point is you have 100 million users in 5 days, which, it doesn't matter how good of an engineer you are at developing a social channel, getting 100 million users is really significant. And really, there's only one company in the world that can probably pull that off, and it's Meta. And I think it's worthy to at least recognize their role in that whole process. We are publishing on Meta, so we're on Facebook here on this platform. We've got YouTube kicking in there. I think we're broadcasting on Twitter and LinkedIn as well.
Yep.
So feel free if you've got questions to fire those away, and we'll try to answer your questions live as well. But as we're rolling with those, I think the significance of it really in number of users is incredibly significant.
Yeah. I don't think we've seen like I said before, I don't think we've seen a social media platform make this big of a splash for a while.
No.
There have been some that have come onto the scene and maybe could have been Twitter threats perhaps, but they've kind of gone away. But threads seems to be here to stay.
Yeah. So, and I think there's a lot of technical things to talk about. We could talk about, the Fetiverse. We can talk about a lot of those things, but I think the biggest headline is 100 million users in a week. When we compare that to Twitter, Twitter certainly has more total users. But when we look at the total number of what they usually would track would be the monthly active users, MAU. You could also track all of them here as weekly active users because they've all been on within the last week in order to sign up. It's a significant number, even relative to Twitter scale.
Yeah. Yes. I've been on threads personally, and it's just blowing up.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's talking about it. So that's why we're here.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a great start, Ben, for you to kind of just give us a basic walkthrough of threads. I think that giving everyone a picture of the platform and its functionality is like a really good place to start, because that's what we all have questions around. Like, what is this thing able to do? How is it different from Twitter? And we can cover all those things. But I think a good place to start would be for you to just walk us through it a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to first maybe just give you a little bit of a view into my threads. Fair warning, it is a safer place than Twitter, but it is not entirely safe. So we'll roll the dice here a little bit. If I flip over to, my device here and just scroll through, we've got some, funny content in here. Clearly we can have all types of content coming in here. But, if we were to look at, cute animal photos, whatever that might be, right? We're still seeing those types of things that we would see on other platforms. But, what we can see is that this interface, at least in the scrolling components, are very similar to Twitter. So I think that at first glance, you're sort of like, oh, it's Twitter. It's the placement of buttons are pretty similar. A lot of the things I would see are similar. Now, if you signed up for Threads, you recognize that there were a couple things that were really critical. You had to sign up with your Instagram account.
Yes.
I think that's a really important component because, one, it did limit the potential audience, at least initially, because you had to have an Instagram account and they're connected. But it also allowed you to follow a bunch of people that you already follow on Instagram right away. So that's part of what it's done is it's had this amount of virality because it's based on a previous platform.
You don't have to start from scratch.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to, sign up again initially with my Instagram account, which brought me into the app right away. I think that's an important component. We'll walk through some other steps here too, but then there were a couple things that were really nuanced. One of them is when you signed up, you had to obviously use your Instagram handle. It used the same handle then to create a Threads account, pulls your whole profile over, really kind of slick process, but it's pulling from Instagram. You're now following a lot of people from Instagram. But then it also included some language about what's called a Fetiverse.
Yes.
So that was kind of a different thing, especially for a mainstream app to say that is kind of a crazy concept.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was getting on Threads, I happened to be in the office and I came across the word Fetiverse and I said, Ben, what are we dealing with here? This Fetiverse. And like he said, there's no platforms really talking about that in such a big picture. So can you go into that a little bit and explain what that is and what that means?
Yeah. So when we first think of the Fediverse, so it's sort of combining two terms, right? Federation, which we sort of know that in our federated democracy, right? Like we have, a bunch of things that are kind of coming together, right? But federation in computer language means that I'm taking a bunch of different places and I'm having the same login to that. So, we actually use this. A lot of you may use applications in the business environment that you would say are single sign-on. That's an example of a federated application where you have the same sign-on, but you're able to get to different data sources or different technologies. So part of what is being promised here by Facebook or Meta or the whole conglomerate of companies is now when they're introducing Threads, is it's not just content from Threads, but they may start pulling content from other sources. And those are other servers. They might be open sourced servers. We don't really know for sure yet what all of those data sources are, but they even named one or two in that little disclaimer. So I think it's a really interesting thing because it starts to say, hey, there could be other sources of data coming into this.
Yeah, I think they mentioned Mastodon and WordPress.
There you go. So yeah, when you start to think about those platforms coming in, and if you're familiar with Mastodon in particular, you can spin up a server and you can call it whatever you want to and create a theme. But then you're sort of like, in charge of that server and all of the content that happens on that server. So part of what this Fediverse would do is pull all of those separate servers together and say, hey, there's one place to view all of that content.
And a single sign-on, right? Like a single, user.
Yeah. So you just use this application, whether right now it's only available on mobile. So as I'm demoing it in mobile, there really isn't a true desktop version of this app. I mean, I could show you, what my profile looks like on a browser. If you went to, essentially threads.net / my handle, then you would see a page that has my content on it. But that's not really the full experience. I can't really click through. I can't respond. I can't post, none of that.
Yeah. So Threads is built very simply right now.
Yeah.
Very simply. And I'm really interested from your perspective as a tech entrepreneur, why would Instagram decide to do that? Why is it built so simply with pretty limited functionality? I mean, right now people can post, people can share. There's no direct messaging. There's no search capability. It's missing some key things. So from your perspective, why? Why are they going so simple at the start?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, if you sort of talk to a team of software developers and you said, what's the hardest thing to do? They would say, go into a really big application that's existed for a long time and then start trying to make big changes to it, right? So if we compare and contrast, Twitter versus where Threads is at, Twitter is an application that's been around for quite a while. It has quite a few different features. And what you would sort of say is that's really hard. Once you remove a feature out of that, then all of a sudden, people say, oh, well, I loved that feature. Now I'm upset, that application.
Right.
So that's a real problem. And so when you have the situation that's existed in Twitter for the last year, it's really that they're going in and trying to hack away major chunks of that application and really make wholesale changes. It's a really hard thing to do. You
Right.
also are very likely to disrupt things, even if you aren't eliminating a large portion of the staff, which they've been doing as
Which
well.
they have been.
Like that also, like, it just creates a real huge challenge. I think what we see in Threads, and I'll show you a couple examples that I think are really fun with Threads in particular, because when we start to look at what Threads is doing, when I go in and I make a new post, right, you'll see it's really simple, right? I have the ability to add text in there. And I can upload a photo. But when I go upload a photo, it's just a photo, right? Now, this is an application that owns Instagram, right? Like, this is started by Instagram.
The photo.
Right. They have
the photo
all
platform.
of the technology to be able to have mass amount of filters. So I think what it really is showing you is there's a tremendous amount of discipline in the software development. And I think it's a great example for anybody if you're launching a new product, and it could be that you're launching a new checking product in banking, right? It's way easier to add a feature later than it is to add all of the features at the beginning and start to take them away. And that's really the model that they're demonstrating here, is that they're able to add features as they go, instead of just throwing those all at you at once. It also gets you excited for the next feature release.
Right.
So there's a couple things, here when I start to look at, my profile, there really isn't much to it. I can share my profile. I can edit my profile. There's really not a lot to it.
Right.
You can see my latest posts in here. But that's about it. Right.
Yeah. It's very simple.
And so they're really starting with that model that is incredibly simple. So yeah, I think as we look to watch their application grow, they're adding those things one by one instead of just throwing them all out there.
So interesting. What are some of the next features that you think we'll see in the near future?
Well, one of them
that
I think was shocking to me when I opened up the application the first time and I looked at my search area. So if I hit search on the bottom, right, it's offering me to follow certain people up here, right? And so, clearly it for some reason thinks that I would be pro Alabama in sports teams.
Never.
We have some great friends from Alabama.
We do. Shout out to our friends from Alabama.
So, but it's got some celebrities in there. It's got some things like that. But the search up here, if I go look for my favorite sports team, and I hit search, you'll notice that it doesn't give me threads or posts or whatever we want to call them at this point. It just gives me accounts. So really, the search is not what we see on Twitter yet. So what's happened there is it's not giving me any feedback to say, this is actually what my intent is, right? It's just giving me a feed of content. So all of the content that I'm seeing in my feed today is just posts that are people that I follow, or it's posts that my friends or the people that I follow are commenting on. So when we say it's a happier place, part of the reason it's a happier place is it's just the people you follow and some of their first connections, nothing else yet.
So when it comes to marketing, we know that gauging intent is very important. So what are the implications of that lack of search capability right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is
for marketers.
If you can't find content, right, from a consumer standpoint, I really want to see search, right? Because I want to see search and hashtags, because then I can actually use it for a news site, right? Today, I'm just seeing the posts that people make, my first connections. I think it's very intentional. Again, just like we don't want to strip out, features, we want to start with a place to say, hey, if there's not enough content here, and they didn't know if they were going to hit 100 million users in a week, but there wasn't enough content, right? I signed up. I was in, I think, the first 500,000 users. So I signed up, and when I did, there were a few posts, but it was just my friends kind of posting in there.
Yeah.
So it takes a little while before we get enough established content
Mm,
before then we actually want to go search and find things like news or use it for research or things like that,
right. Right.
which I'm used to using Twitter for. So I think that's an important component.
So you mentioned prior, and I think as we've heard the coverage of threads, we've heard the phrase Twitter killer.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think it would be great to talk a little bit more about threads versus Twitter and some of those similarities, which we kind of covered. I mean, obviously the platform itself, in its design, in its appearance, it's pretty similar.
Yeah.
What are some of the differences? What are some of the major differences that are going to matter, do you think?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think one of them, that we've all talked about, and I think, quite honestly, Elon and Zuck are both right. I think that's what we're calling them both.
Yeah, yeah.
So like Elon is posting about, I mean, literally his tweets are like, "Hey, there's also bad things here," on Twitter,
Mhm.
and I think Facebook's trying to essentially say, "Hey, we want to create a safer, happier place." Now, that I don't think anybody's here to say that there's like one utopia over the other. I think Elon's first comments were all about open, free space.
Mhm.
We're not going to filter anything. And then he started filtering things, that disagreed with him.
Yeah.
In Zuckerberg's world, he's filtering things for sure, and I don't think he makes any. It pulls any punches in that.
Mhm.
So I think the filtering is going to be really important. I think it's really important as advertisers. How do we have that conversation if we know that things are being filtered in one side or the other?
Mhm.
We know that that's happening. So I don't think that's any secret. So there's a little bit of an angle there that quite honestly feels a little political,
Yeah.
but it may be
Yes.
less political and a little bit more about who owns it and controls it. Right? We have a large publicly traded company on one side, and then we have a very large single owner company on the other side. That creates two very different scenarios
For
as far
sure.
as governance goes. And in Twitter's case, they released and had resignations for all of their safety council as of late last year.
That's a big deal.
Facebook has said, "Hey, we're continuing to enhance that area." So that creates a different type of algorithm in that case.
Right, right. And Ben, you've talked to me a little bit about just Meta's advantage in general when it comes to user base and the things that they already have in place. Can you talk a little bit more about that and explain what that looks like?
Yeah, from a software engineering perspective, it's difficult to get 100 million users on anything
Yeah.
in 5 days and
Mhm.
not have it fail, right? When we think of what sort of application has onboarded 100 million users from start to finish in a short amount of time, very few things in the world have ever done that. That's an engineering feat to not have any downtime and have that work. Now, I mean, the cold reality is Meta already has 1 billion users. So is it really 100 million new users? Well, it's just one of their companies, right?
Right.
But I think that's really significant because we've seen a lot of downtime as we've been messing with things in the last year at Twitter, and so to see that not be the case over here with Threads is certainly significant. I think what's also significant, I pointed to it with photos, but I think we're going to see it with a lot of other pieces that we will start to see new functionality come into Threads in a very intentional way.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see evolve.
I think Zuck is trying to, in that sort of mechanical way that he presents himself, and he's presenting himself on Threads in a very mechanical way as well, which is trying to say, this is a calculated platform. This is how we're going to be rolling things out. We're listening, we're active. And I think some of that is because he's listening to a publicist who's saying the other side of that conversation is Twitter, which is doing the opposite. So I think that's really the contrast that you're seeing within these two platforms.
Right. Yes. So as these features evolve And as we see, we can't predict what it's going to look like in the future, but let's talk a little bit about what the content on Threads is looking like right now and how it might evolve in the future.
Well, I think you said it when we were setting up part of this conversation. You were like, hey, it's like people just announcing themselves or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think I said shouting out into the abyss.
Yeah. And honestly, I feel like that's part of it, right?
Yes.
Like, I've watched some people, and even, when we're preparing to talk about this from an expert sort of standpoint, right? Like, I'm not here to say, here's how to maximize Threads. Like that's not like, I've been on it since Thursday.
Right.
And
Right.
Now, I don't think there's an expert way to be addressing that yet. So what we're seeing is a lot of people that are taking, hey, maybe I was going to post this on Twitter and now I'll post it over here in Threads.
Cross-posting.
Do people engage that? Do they not engage with that? Do I change it a little bit? See what happens? Oh, there's not hashtags, so not really sure what to post over here. So there's a lot of that happening, and there's certainly a lot of people who are comfortable on Twitter who are coming over saying, hey, this doesn't have that feature I'm used to using on Twitter. That's happening frequently too.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the conversation on Threads is about Threads right now. Right? It's about the new platform. Yeah, I've seen just a lot of bigger brands, celebrities announcing their presence, maybe in a funny, kitschy way that goes along with their brand tone. I think it's interesting to point out, when Threads first came out and we were kind of all getting on, I felt a little bit of maybe overwhelm, right? Like, oh my gosh, here's another social media platform that we need to learn and we need to discover, and oh, should we already be on it, right? Should we already be posting on it as a brand? And I dug into some research a little bit and found that some of the bigger brands we're seeing on Threads were working with Instagram and made aware that Threads was going to be launched along a certain time frame. So they were working with Instagram to be ready for that launch, to be ready for posting. So they actually had time to put together an intentional content strategy for Threads. And so brands like Wendy's and Netflix, who have that sort of real-time, witty tone baked into their strategy, are off and running. And we look at it and we're like, oh, we want to be doing that, right? But like, nobody had time to put together a strategy. So I think it's good for us all to just take a breath.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, number one in my feed was Shakira for some reason. And a lot of people were commenting on that for some reason, they had sort of selected her to be one of the top. Now, I mean, I do like Shakira, but.
Well, I'm waiting for Beyonce's arrival.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think it's happened yet.
But I'm not really sure why that was, top of the list. Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's some quirks and things like that. But, when we think about the content as it evolves, if there's no search built into the platform, the way you create content is very different, right? You're not trying to be found, right? You're creating content for the people you see right in front of you. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing that really ties into, by stripping out a lot of those extra features, is that a lot of the reason people are active on it is because they have an emotional attachment to it. And I think that's really what Threads wants to create at this point, is how do I get people to have an emotional attachment to Threads before they then become, advocates and decision makers based on, hey, there's this certain feature, or there's this certain content, or there's a certain thing. They want to be emotionally wrapped into it. And I think it's a very intentional strategy by Meta, that they're saying, if we can get the right people on the platform, if we can get a level of positivity, and then we can show a high contrast between that and what they're seeing on Twitter, then by the time we start introducing things like search and news and things like that, hopefully we already have an emotional attachment to that platform.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you lay it out like that. It's very intentional. Each step of it is very intentional. And with marketing, as we know, and to make brands successful, that emotion is so important. And so for them to tap into that is just super interesting and smart, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to do as an application, as as someone who creates a product, right? And for all of us, whatever it is we're creating, I think
Yeah.
it's a great model to be thinking about. If I'm thinking about a banking product, right? How do I get people emotionally tied to
That's
that
right.
banking product before we then add this feature? So it's about being a product company before a feature company, and I think they've done a
Love that.
masterful job of doing that first and foremost.
Mhm.
Now, as we look at it for a potential marketing opportunity, now we start to look at it and say, well, if we know that people have an emotional attachment to being there, then they're less likely to leave it. I think the contrast in a lot of ways is if we start thinking of platforms like iPhone versus Android, right? People are emotionally attached to their iPhones,
Yes.
sometimes more so than the feature. Like when I think about, hey, is the only real, and you saw my iPhone here, but like if I think of really is the only killer feature the way that we message, that blue or green bubble comes
Mhm.
up. If that's the only real difference, that's not much of a feature difference.
Yeah.
It's more of an emotional difference. And so
Mm.
I think that's essentially what Meta is trying to create here is an emotional connection to it, so that then when you get challenged on, hey, this platform has this versus this platform has that, you'll defend it and say, no, I'm pro Threads versus versus Twitter, whatever other
Yeah.
alternative.
Yeah. All right, Ben. Let's have the rubber meet the road here.
Okay. Okay.
So for all the financial brands listening, I know we have people tuning in across the country. What do we do right now? This is also new. We're hearing all this talk about it. What's your advice for financial brand marketers out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them is exactly what we're doing. Have some conversations about
Yeah.
it. Challenge each other. Ask, are you? In what ways do you see yourself being emotionally attached to this platform? In what are the features and what's the intention behind this? I think that's really important. When you have the kind of resources they do, it's a really fun marketing exercise to start digesting why they're doing what they're doing. Because if our whole goal as marketers is to build that customer experience and tap into that, then they're doing a masterful job and they have a bigger budget than all of us combined, right? So I think that's worthy of just watching
Yeah.
as an audience of marketers, and going on there and lurking, and I don't know, maybe did you shout into the abyss yet?
I haven't shouted
Okay,
into the
okay.
abyss.
Well, I mean, as a copywriter, like
I know.
you should.
I know. I need something interesting enough has to happen to me before I shout into the abyss.
All right. Well, we're gonna
Maybe
make that happen.
Maybe I'll post a photo of my dog.
There you go. So yeah. I mean, I think shouting into the abyss is part of it.
Yeah,
I think just watching people and engaging with some of that content, and then you start to get some of that feedback that says, hey, people like that content, they don't like that content. What's the sort of style and tone? I always say different social media channels are kind of like a different culture, right? I love to travel, and if I travel and I'm in a different state or a different country, right? You sort of have this mode that you're like, hey, actually, I'm up north, right? We don't wear our sunglasses around our neck, right? But if I'm in the South, we do, right? Like there's different things like that.
Yeah.
That just culturally you start to learn and understand. You start to understand, do we call it a post or do we call it a thread?
Right.
I think that's a debate. Like all of those things become a debate. So as we're learning this type of platform, we start to really gather that feedback, and we start to say, as a brand, there's certain things that I would do on a platform like Threads that I would not do on Instagram, I wouldn't do on Facebook, and I might not do on Twitter, just depending on how that lays out. So I think there's a lot to learn.
A lot to learn. And yeah, I mean, for me, just being on the platform and observing has been so key in understanding it, right? And seeing how it evolves and just keeping close tabs on how it is evolving, so that if and when it becomes a viable marketing platform for financial brands, we're ready to rock. But maybe before we go here, let's talk a little bit about archival and what that looks right now. Because as we know what that looks like, we know that's so important for our industry. What features does it have? Does it have anything? Does it have any API connections right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think I follow some of the people who have created threads, and I'll share one of them here in a moment.
Cool.
But when we think about it, as far as archival and compliance, we're not there yet.
Mhm.
There's not any approved way to do that at this
Mhm.
point. We also are not quite yet seeing a fully opened platform for places like Google. So, one of the things that was always an appeal for Twitter in the
Mhm.
early days is that the search engine optimization was just baked into it. If I make a tweet, that's indexed by Google, every one of them, right? Now, we've seen Musk pull back on that
Mhm.
because he doesn't want third parties seeing all of that content. He doesn't want that content out in the world.
Mhm.
Now, the jury's still out on threads, right? We don't
Right.
quite know. And since it's not available for a desktop, we really don't know what's available yet for that sort of, search engine optimization, right? So, when we hear Elon say things like, we don't want bots, we don't want scraping, we don't want any of
Mhm.
those things, what he's also saying in a lot of cases is, we don't want Google seeing our data. So that's a really interesting storyline that we're going to start to evolve to understand. But it also means for now, we don't have any approved way to archive that content. If you're using a brand for your financial brand and you're like, hey, I want to log in with my Instagram, that's actually a different login. So you have to log out, log back
Mhm.
in. So there's some quirky things about that quite honestly, I think they're trying to limit the amount that we're seeing that. And so it's a nice way for them to say, yeah, you can only log into one at a time. So it kind of slows you down a little bit, kind of
Interesting.
intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think over time that'll get faster. I was going to show you one of the accounts I follow here. Mosseri is actually the person in charge of the Threads application, and so you'll see some stats that he likes to share about how often are you seeing thread puns used on Google
Thread
over the
count.
last 30 days, right? So there's things like that that are kind of fun.
Mhm.
He's also showing his fitness score of this last week and
Oh, wow,
when
okay.
and when it
Oh,
launched.
good.
But what's probably more interesting is he's actually responding some of the first responses to say, hey, here are features that we are looking to add. And so,
Mhm.
within Threads, you can flip over to that replies tab and you can start to see what his responses are. But he's actually responding to product and feature requests on the platform
It's
itself.
just so interesting that we're seeing that in real time.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about is just
Mhm.
that's the way that they're choosing to help co-create with the platform users is to get them involved in that process, whether or not they're actually listening or whether or not they already have a fully developed roadmap and they're just essentially asking some questions. I don't know.
Which is another way to get people emotionally involved, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, stay tuned. I think it's going to be a fascinating platform. I think there's some ways that financial brands can get positioned for this. One of those is if you're not on Instagram, this is a fantastic opportunity to reserve your handle on Instagram,
Yeah.
which in effect also helps you reserve a place on Threads.
Yeah. Good
So
point.
I think that's one of the first steps
Mhm.
if you're not there for some reason. But that's a great first step. And then I think staying active there and just being involved personally is a great step.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Jess, it's been fun to have the chat.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun chatting about this before it started.
We did.
Stay tuned, more things to come. But thanks everybody for being a part of the conversation. It's been great.
Yeah, it has been.